Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 84 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the living space of Lawrence and Beverly's suburban house on the outskirts of East London. It is 1977, and the room displays the classic decor of the period. A leather three-piece suite, an onyx coffee table, a prominently placed bar, a sheepskin rug. Donna Summer's Love to Love You Baby is playing on the stereo. Lawrence and Beverly have invited their new neighbors in for drinks, ostensibly to welcome them to the street, but also as much to show off their house, for Beverly is certainly house-proud, having acquired the material accoutrements of the middle-class life she has aspired to. The evening does not pan out as planned, however. Under the carefully constructed social veneer, darker realities of Lawrence and Beverly's life together smolder and finally erupt in a shocking denouement. This is the iconic 1970s period drama, Abigail's Party, written by playwright and filmmaker Mike Leigh. The play's portrait of Lawrence and Beverly's vain social pretensions is both hugely funny and excruciating to witness, as is the cruelty and despair that underlie their behavior. In fact, Leigh himself called the play a tragi-comedy. Abigail's Party was first performed at the Hampstead Theatre in London in April 1977, and then famously broadcast as a play for today on BBC One later the same year, with Alison Steadman reprising her performance as the domineering yet vulnerable hostess Beverly. The play has been a staple of amateur and professional theatre ever since, popularly renowned for its iconic snapshot of the material and social fabric of its time. As we record this episode, a vibrant new production of the play is on stage at the Theatre Royal, Stratford East, directed by the theatre's artistic director, Nadia. And I'm delighted to say that Nadia has joined me today to talk us through this classic of British theatre. Welcome, Nadia. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Before we go further, I must do a brief proper introduction to Nadia. She has been the artistic director at Stratford East for the past 7 years, during which time her directing credits include Conor McPherson's Shining City, The Village by April DeAngelis, and King Hedley II by August Wilson with Lenny Henry, to name but a few. Previously, she was an associate director at the National Theatre, where her productions included Inua Ellam's African update of Chekhov's Three Sisters, Our Country's Good, Dara, and Chewing Gum Dreams with Michaela Cole, as well as her own play, Home. Nadia's debut feature film, Brides, appeared in the Grade 8 showcase at Cannes this year, and as from January 2025, Nadia will be the new artistic director at the Young Vic Theatre. So, Nadia, what drew you to want to direct this play now? Because I'm bound to jump straight in and ask you, can this play that is such an iconic period piece still be relevant in our world today?
I think it really can. Actually, to be completely honest with you, I knew of the play as in it's a cult classic and everyone's heard of Abigail's Party, but I guess it was a huge deal for the generation slightly older than mine. And so I was at a Boxing Day dinner with some dear friends, actors, and they had been around in the time of the original production and said, you should direct Abigail's Party at Stratford East. We think it will be right up your street. And I didn't know whether to be offended or delighted because I didn't know the play. So I went and read it and I saw the film and I was delighted. I thought, well, this is just so dark, yet so funny. And I absolutely recognize these people because twitching curtains and outdoing the neighbors and trying to find meaning and belonging through accumulating things and material wealth is something that has never gone away. And in fact, I would say our illness about looking right and having a nice car and house and going on the right holidays and putting it on Instagram, I would say that illness has got tenfold, 20-fold in my generation right now. So I feel it's more relevant than ever, to be honest with you.
Yes, you can certainly imagine Beverly on Insta, can't you? Just taking
Absolutely.
pictures of herself in her room and
Being a kind of influencer. Yeah, no, I absolutely can. Having her nails done and her hair done. And it completely reminds me of The Only Way is Essex and that sort of culture. And absolutely recognize from my own family and friends and people around that live and work around my theatre in Stratford East that this idea of when we've made it, we'll go out and we'll set up life and home in suburbia, and it'll be leafy and it will be more civilized and not like the big smoke. But I just think, you know, suburbia behind those lovely homes is anything but civilized. You know, people can be quite dog eat dog. So yeah.
I'm beginning to be a bit worried because I'm sitting here in suburbia as we speak, but
You should be. You should be petrified.
no confessions coming. Actually, it's interesting you mentioned the film of the play. It's such a period landmark in British TV, as famous possibly for the image of the 1970s style. And I wondered you weren't daunted by that when you were directed to it, because it is rather a statement of style, isn't it? All that orange and brown, the fashion, the haircuts, the food, the cubes of cheese and pineapple on cocktail sticks, all that. And I wondered if there's a risk that producers and audience might get too focused on that period detail and design.
I think there can be. I think if the play is reduced to having a laugh about the eccentric aesthetic of the 70s, the funny clothes, the moustaches, the orange and the browns, I think if that's the only joke, the play is in trouble. But because it is a period piece and we watch period dramas all the time, and I think why period classics or modern classics stand the test of time is because they're saying something about the human condition. But you're right, it is a bit sort of worrying as an artist, as a director, and certainly working closely with my designer, Peter. We wanted it to be authentic because it is a period piece, but we didn't want the costume or the set to do all the talking and obscure really the actors and the story. So it's there, but I think Peter's has done an incredible job of it's certainly a statement without being a block to the spirit of the play.
I agree. It's all there in the beautiful set and costumes in your show. But I noticed in the program notes in your production that Peter said that he was determined the design should not be so kitsch as to overwhelm the real psychological drama that's playing out. And rightly, this room does feel like a real room, as it should, with real lives being lived out in it. I wanted to ask you about the time is important, though. And let's talk a bit about where the play came from, how Leigh's own background and what was happening in the country at the time inspired these themes. Do you know much about where this came from?
Well, I mean, Mike talks a lot about and writes very eloquently about his own life and how that's inspired a lot of his work. And he talks a lot about the idea of the done thing and his parents always being worried by the done thing. And he found that a mantra that was very stifling as a young man. And I guess most young people and artists are stifled by anything that feels too strict. But he did feel that from his own childhood into the 70s, and then eventually the 80s and Thatcher, that had sort of grown and snowballed into this much bigger thing, which was a materialism that was much more aggressive. And I recognize my parents got married the year this play was out, and they were Asian immigrants, and they also cared about having the right stuff and being accepted. And their mantra and a theme tune I grew up with was, "What will people say?"
Ah.
And they sort of are all part of the same club, those kind of mantras, because it's always worrying about being accepted by the neighbors, by society. And, you know, we're all afraid of that. We're all afraid from when we're in the playground as children, not belonging somehow.
Yeah.
Not being good enough, not being loved. And that's the kind of root of all of our angst and pain. And I think that Leigh does it very beautifully, the way he observes people that are being really cruel and like monsters, but underneath those monsters are people that are deeply insecure and sad.
Yeah, well, we'll come to these characters and how that's expressed, but you're right in terms of the time. I think he suggested that it was partly to do with his parents' post-war background, and that it might have been in response to the chaos of war, that they're more concerned to preserve social security or convention somehow.
Yes, but the 70s, as you know, lots of us know, was a very volatile time politically and economically, with strikes and an oil crisis. And, you know, there was a 3-day working week because there wasn't enough electricity. It was very, very turbulent. But for all the poverty and friction between different classes and so on, for the first time, there was upwardly mobile working class of a newer middle class that were going from industrial work into being office workers. So Lawrence is an estate agent. His parents would never have had an opportunity like that. And being an estate agent, you can quickly pretend to be middle class. So we see all these new jobs referred to in the play. It's very sort of modest and says this isn't a state of the nation play. But I think it really is, because it really does capture a moment and what was going on and what people's mentality was.
I think there's also a bit of background, isn't there, from the 60s into the 70s, where the younger people sort of threw off the shackles of some of the conventions. So there's a bit of that turbulence going on in the 70s. And it's interesting the way it's being replaced, as he suggests, I guess, by this consumerism as well that's to come, particularly under Thatcher. But there's also, of course, the model or the suggestion of what's coming in Abigail, the daughter.
Yeah, the punk.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, this sort of quiet suburban life, there may be some disruption to come. I was also interested in Leigh's method of actually developing the play. I noticed that the credits on the TV version stated that it was devised by Mike Leigh. And there's a note on the title page of the published text that states that Abigail's party was evolved from scratch entirely by rehearsal through improvisation. So can you tell us something about how this process worked, and how do you think it may have affected the play we see?
Yes, he's famous for being somebody that works through improvisation, both in film and with plays. And after long form improvs, he then distills the story and crafts the play. And so, you know, he's very good now that Mike also cites his company of actors as being co-authors in a way nowadays, because of how much they are responsible for creating the dialogue and so on. I actually do use improvisation in my work. I mean, not to this extent on this play, but I'll often improvise the backstories of the characters. For example, the day Beverly invites people to her house, you know, we do that improv. So it's a very tangible memory in the actors' heads. So I love improvisation, but we did not use improvisation. We used obviously the script that was improvised. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea you're thinking about what has Beverly's day been before these people arrive, for example. And also I did read that the original actors actually got into character and went to the Ideal Home exhibition, you know, in terms of absorbing this concern about, you know, how the house was furnished, and that Alison Steadman had seen a woman in Selfridges actually demonstrating lipstick, because there's a famous scene with the lipstick.
Yes, yes.
And of course, Beverly was, I think, a cosmetics.
Yeah, makeup girl. Yeah.
But you're right. I think it's imagining that detailed background to characters in this way. Perhaps it helps establish a more authentic foundation for their psychological behavior when it comes to the actors playing that out. For listeners who do not know the play, we've talked quite a lot already about some of these details, but there will be international listeners. In fact, you may be less familiar with this British classic, Nadia, and may not get a chance to see your show here in London, I'm afraid. I wonder if you could give us a brief introduction to the characters and a summary of what happens in the plot. And I'm hasten to say, we may not be able to avoid spoilers as we talk through this today. So if you're going to see the show in Stratford, you can turn off now and come back later and listen afterwards. But otherwise, we're going to plow on. So can you set us up here as to who these people are and what happens?
Well, the play was performed in 1977. So in my mind, it's set in 1977. In my mind, it's in Essex in a suburb, but it could be any sort of London, Greater London suburb, in a quiet street where Beverly, a housewife, invites new neighbours, Angela and Tony, round for drinks. And she also invites Sue, another neighbour whose teenage daughter is having a party, hence the title Abigail's Party. The funny thing is, the party's happening next door. So we're not actually at the party. So it's already led you the wrong way down the garden path, as we say.
I was going to ask you, why did he call it Abigail's Party?
Well, I think it's a Mike Leigh mischief. The party, which you can hear because the music's loud and the kids are screaming, the real punk rock party of the 15-year-old daughter is happening next door. And Sue, the mother, and the two new neighbours around at Beverly's, along with Beverly's husband, Lawrence. So it should be a little civilized drinks. But actually, Beverly is one of these people in life who likes to be the ringmaster, and she enforces drinking. Nobody can say no to a drink. There's enforced conversation and a lot of gossip and a bit of sexual frisson as she dances very blatantly, flirtatiously with Tony from next door. So it's a kind of play where nothing happens, but everything happens.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of evening where you would really not like to be a guest. You would run if you could, but it's like watching an awful car crash. You can't look away. And it's the manipulation of everyday people for whatever reason. It's devilish, it really is. And that's the story. She picks at the legs of spiders, and she relishes it, but she has her own demons. And there is quite a Greek ending at the end.
I love that. That's a good way to describe it, a Greek ending. And also a fantastic way to describe it, picking at the legs of the spiders, because it is Beverly driving the show really throughout, her domineering performance, I would have to say, as hostess.
Yeah, she definitely is a diva, but then she's a housewife who's, I think, in my own interpretation, is actually incredibly intelligent and has completely got nothing to do all day.
Yeah.
So this is her only activity, is to show people her perfectly manicured house and to toy with her neighbors, because there's nothing else she can do with herself.
Yes, I mean, to let her hair down a bit, to drink, to have a bit of a dance, a bit of a rave. I mean, I think she's bored. As she said, she's bored.
She's a bored housewife.
Yeah. As you mentioned, the Greek ending, there is a very dramatic ending to the play. But in fact, as you also say, otherwise, the play is an ordinary, somewhat awkward to and fro of this small social gathering. And as you say, I think most of them don't want to be there. But like all the most interesting drama, as you also say, it comes from the subtext that points at the truth of the characters' sense of identity or their relationships and what lies underneath a lot of the contrived appearances, particularly for Beverly. So let's talk about these characters a bit more in detail. And Beverly is the dominant presence, as the conductor orchestrating everyone else throughout the evening. She's a focus of social satire, I guess, in Leigh's hands as well, her social pretension, isn't she?
Yes, but some commentators have said the play is laughing at the lower middle classes or these aspirational working classes, but I don't think he is. I think he's describing the people he knows and grew up with that are real and recognizable, and he does it with love. So nobody has the monopoly on evil in the play, and nobody has the monopoly on good. Everybody, like all of us, has light and shade. And so I think, yes, it really is about the human condition. So yes, Beverly is, as we've said, the ringmaster and a bored housewife, but she also has this incredible speech about how her mother and father haven't spoken in 20 years and how cruel her father has been to her mother. And it's a really good discourse of the 1970s about marriage and the place of women.
Yes.
Women at this time have only just, I think, been able to have their own bank account. They can't sign a check without their husband's signature. I mean, this is nuts. We forget the misogyny of the time. So she is the product of her own upbringing and environment.
I think you're right. There was a Dennis Potter review where he thought the perspective was flawed, that we are basically laughing at these lower class characters in a condescending way that is simply sneering. I think the word might have been used at some point, which Leigh defended by saying that he was sympathetic to the characters, whatever their foibles, not least Beverly. The play is a lamentation, he said, not a sneer. And it's a play about us, not them.
Absolutely. And it does bug me, actually. I mean, I haven't had it this time round, but over the years, when I've made work about the class I was born into and brought up with, and whenever you do, for want of a more eloquent way of putting it, and I wish there was a better way of putting it that I could think of, but working class plays or plays about the working classes or upwardly mobile working classes into middle class, everybody assumes you're sneering, and you're not. I am them, they are me. And so is my audience here at Stratford East, and all of the company are playing the class they were born into. You know, Tamsin Outhwaite, who plays Beverly, knows Beverly's. She has been brought up in Essex, and that goes for every single character in the play. We're playing our truth, and it comes with darkness, but it is never with a haughtiness or an air of looking down upon. That's really important to me, actually.
Well, but even more truthful, I think, is the fact that these behaviors are not exclusive to whatever class you are categorized as.
Absolutely.
That is the point.
Yeah.
And although there is clearly satire on her snobbishness, that's part of, I guess, Leigh's take on the consumer material world and the ethos of that world of the time. And we can laugh at that snobbishness. It doesn't mean we aren't also snobbish in our own way. But also what's fascinating about her is it seems very performative at times, right? She's on display, even to herself at times. She thinks she's performing. So there's something fascinating about the gap between her performance and the real identity of her.
Yeah.
Because even before anyone arrives, she's attentive to every detail, the presentation in the room and herself. She's conscious of how this is going to present. And they're all received ideas in some way about how to behave too, right? She has Cosmopolitan magazine. So she's trying to build some kind of character.
Some persona.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really matters to her that she is hostess with the mostess and is talked about as being this gorgeous, wonderful host with a beautiful home. She really cares what people think of her and has curated the evening. But of course, she also likes to drink. And as she drinks, and as they all drink, I think she's trying to drink to be free.
Yes.
And get out of her head. But as she drinks, her true accent, for me as a Londoner, I can really hear her trying to be well-spoken and that dissolving as the evening goes. Because her real accent comes, there's a brilliant line where she's going very romantically, talking about Elvis, who would have just died this year. I think he died
in 77, yeah.
Yeah, which is the year this play was on. So she's talking very eloquently and romantically about Elvis. And then she goes, "Oh, I just need to go toilet." And earlier on in the play, when she's not drunk, she says lavatory, if you'll pardon my French.
Yes.
And then after all those gin and tonics, it's just, I'm going toilet.
It's the real her.
It's the real her. Yeah.
Leigh said somewhere that she may be perceived as monstrous. She's in fact vulnerable, insecure, and sad. And you talked about her parents. There's some clues, aren't there, in her backstory, I guess?
There's huge clues, and he doesn't do it, again, with any malice, that everybody in this play has been married to the wrong person.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not that they're terrible people. It's just they're terrible for each other.
Yeah.
She tries to touch her husband. He flinches. He feels emasculated by her comments. The other couple, there's obviously a problem. They're not connecting. He doesn't want to go to bed with her. They talk about that.
She wants children. He doesn't necessarily yet.
Yeah. And you just go, God, it's life, isn't it? For whatever reason, you marry somebody that you think you should marry and it's the wrong person. So I think it's a really brilliant observation on the idea of marriage as well.
Yes, because Beverly says more than once that she's bored. And then she says somewhere, doesn't she, that she, of course, needs a bloke. Let's face it, we all need a bloke. He's very good with money, but apart from that, it's just boring. She's in a position where she's dependent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it's maybe sounds a bit old-fashioned now, but would absolutely marry for security. That's how people survived. And to marry for money wouldn't have been an alien thought. Of course, we all need a bloke. I mean, these are phrases that I hear even today.
Yeah. But she says even that she probably wouldn't have married Lawrence if she'd lived with him before they got married.
Yeah.
So that's not a good sign.
No.
Leigh actually also said that from Lawrence's point of view, he talked about his prize catch wife and that they're on the way up. She's glamorous looking. He thinks he's scored there. But as you say, in so many other ways, they're mismatched. And there's certainly suggestions that not all is well in their sexual relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he really wants to be middle class. He wants to talk about art.
Yeah.
He wants to talk about books, but he's not read any of them. And his wife wants to get drunk and flirt and dance. And they've got just a different spirit and no patience for each other's ways. And they're just completely mismatched.
Leigh said that Lawrence yearns for the highbrow. It's a pretension that I don't think he's really going to realize. But as you say, because he thinks it's social currency, and he doesn't think that Beverly will match these aspirations in this regard, that she's a Philistine, and calls her ignorant. In fact, they have this heated argument about art and taste. But his pretensions are they're sort of touching, but they're also kind of pathetic in a way, the way that he targets Sue, the next door neighbor, who's more middle class.
Oh, yeah. She's definitely blue blonde. The way she talks, her references, but he assumes that she will be his partner in crime. He assumes she'll talk about Van Gogh or Van Gogh, he calls, and then he assumes that she will like to talk about the new people moving in a condescending way, which I hope is sharper in our production, because I've cast 2 South Asian actors to play Angela and Tony. And because he's an estate agent, it's clear that he rejected showing them around because they said, we've met you before at the beginning of the play.
So yes.
And he obviously doesn't want people that he assumes are less rich and, in this case, also aren't white, moving into the street and bringing the neighborhood down. I mean, he is a bigot, and he tries to recruit Sue, posh Sue, to join him in that sort of jackal cafe of condescension, and she doesn't want to. She's not on his team.
No. When he asked her, don't you think the area is going down? And he says, no. She says, it's more mixed, that's all. She doesn't think there's anything wrong with that, to which Lawrence replies, that's a matter of opinion. Clearly, he thinks there's something wrong with that, and she won't go along with it. And it was really more pointed in your production by your casting. It certainly sharpens your focus. And all this sounds pretty familiar in our day and age, going back to how relevant this play is. But it also is very interesting that he uses it as a kind of riposte in this bit of a battle between himself and Tony, because he's been humiliated to some degree by Beverly flirting and dancing with Tony. While he was asking and directing these questions at Sue about the neighborhood, he was actually directing them really at Tony as a sort of pointed attack.
Yeah. It was passive aggression, He won't say, I hate your kind, but he will say, oh, Sue, don't you think the neighborhood's gone down? But, Tony's no fool in that Tony might be monosyllabic, but he can, like all of us, we can feel when somebody's being bigoted towards us for whatever reason, whether it's race or sexuality or class or anything. We know when the air in the room has changed. And Tony's aware, and everybody's aware, I think. Even Angela becomes aware, who's his wife. So Lawrence, it's not his finest hour.
No. And I, as I was saying about his cultural pretensions, that he was trying to bring Sue on side, or basically trying to demonstrate his credentials and align himself with her. But also there's an interesting speech, isn't there, where there may be a glimmer of self-awareness on his part when he talks about music and arty elements, that he has no talent himself, and that anything he's achieved has been through hard graft. And he knows he's not special, and that his life has been a fight, and that he's ordinary.
Yeah, it's a very sad monologue, actually.
Isn't it?
It's a very painful monologue about being, what's the word, mediocre. and being someone who wasn't born with incredibly striking looks or the ability to play the violin, or he's actually talking about artists and wishing he could have been born with talent. But I think he's sort of self-harming and self-coaching when he says, look, you can't cry about it. You've got to buck up your ideas and move on, and life's a slog. And I just can imagine him as a young boy just going, oh, I'm in the school play. And his father saying, what the hell? And saying probably something homophobic and something probably, what good is that? And beating the living daylights out of him. That's what I imagine would have happened to him. And I think that it's not that he wasn't born with talent. It was that even if he had a talent, it wouldn't have had 2 minutes to see the light of day.
The world he knows is no place for his sensitivity, whatever that sensitivity might be.
Yeah, no, I imagine his dad was a barrow boy, you know, this is a self-made man, and that's why he's a workaholic, because he has something to prove to the world, and he just thinks if he'll stop, he'll drown. I think Lawrence has seen some poverty and therefore will never go hungry again. And that's why he works like a dog and killing himself in the process.
Yeah. I partly thought that some of that might be that he would rather not be at home with his wife. But let's talk a bit more about Tony and his wife, Angela. Tony does represent some sort of masculine threat to Lawrence, I think, as we've touched on. But he's also not very comfortable in this company. He absolutely doesn't want to be at this party, I think. He's been dragged there by his wife.
Yeah. His wife's probably said, look, we've got to get on with the neighbours. And we've been invited. It would be rude not to go. Probably bribed him with, look, we'll stay for 20 minutes. And hours later. Also, I think he's seen Lawrence, and we know that they've met Lawrence before, even though Lawrence pretends that he didn't. So he was an estate agent that, for whatever reason, didn't show them around. And they went with another agent.
Yeah. So there's history there.
There's history there. And I think he knows that this man is condescending. And he's younger and he's got his own insecurities. He's not a talker, but you can see him watching. I really enjoy watching Omar, who plays Tony, and Pandora that plays Sue, because you see how things land through them. And as much as I love film and love the film of Abigail's Party, the play for me is all the more delicious because the audience can look several ways at once.
Yes.
And you can see the detail of how things land, whereas the camera has to look at the person speaking most of the time.
I was struck by that, having watched the film again recently, that I was slightly frustrated having seen your show, because there were times where the camera would just be on one person. And that was frustrating that they had to make that decision to isolate on one person.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. He doesn't have the social training or language to participate in this setting. So he's not that comfortable. But there are also signs about their marriage, his marriage with Angela. What's going on there?
Well, yeah, I feel that he was a guy that was a promising footballer. He was a professional footballer. And through whatever happened, injury or anger management issues or whatever it was, he lost that huge opportunity in his life.
Or not good enough.
Maybe.
All he says is it didn't work out.
Yeah.
But it's a failure for him.
It's a failure. Well, it's a dream taken away. And the fact is he was good enough to be in the first, not in the reserves. So he was a good enough athlete to reach a certain level. And for whatever reason, it didn't work out. And we all know that could be for a myriad of reasons. And you go from being a star where people adore you to being nobody.
Yep.
And he's not good with words. We assume he's a fool. I don't think he is, but I think he's lost something and is still grieving for it, his career. And he's married to someone who is wonderful and ridiculously positive. And she can't see the bad in him, even though she can feel it. And he doesn't warm to her. But I think there's a little twist at the end.
Ah, yes, I was going to come to that.
Yeah, I think he sees her, because we all assume she's a bit of an airhead. I hate that term, but that she's just talks and most of it's rubbish. But then in the end, where she really comes into her own, and we all feel like, wow, she really does take control. And I think he sees her in a new light. And the romantic in me wants to feel like maybe he has a newfound respect for her.
Yes, I agree with you about that interpretation. I think that may well be there anyway. She does talk. She doesn't edit herself. So she's sort of naively open and tactless at times. And that drives him a bit spare because she reveals things about their personal life, which he would rather not share.
Yeah.
And then displays weaknesses of his.
She has no filter.
No, exactly. And, you can imagine that driving anybody mad, really, in his position. But also there's some suggestive lines which are a bit worrying where, she can say things like he's very quick-tempered. He's not violent, just nasty. Like the other day, he said to me he'd like to sellotape my mouth. And if he comes home and he's in a bad mood, I can't do anything right. And they're always having rows. I mean, it sounds a bit grim.
It is.
And they also hint at sexual issues in that marriage as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very well-observed play that actually sexual decline in a marriage is only the symptom of other things, which is people are not connecting in any way and they're resenting each other for not being who they wanted. And that's a tale as old as time. But I think that communication is an issue between the couples. Also, violence that is suggested between Tony and Angela. Domestic violence is a thing on the increase. It hasn't gone away. It's probably just more hidden. But I know that in the 70s and 80s, people would shout at their wives and push them around. Nobody would say anything necessarily. The things that we speak about now quite openly as being wrong, I think people got away with it.
There are moments where he speaks really sharply to her towards the end, and she says he's quick-tempered, and you can imagine that it could be very forceful, could even become physical.
Yeah.
And he's quite controlling. There's the point she would like to drive, but he won't let her take lessons, even though it'd be more convenient for her to get to work.
Yeah.
So there's a controlling element there.
We'd call that coercive control today and a form of abuse. Yeah, and it certainly is. Just because it didn't have a label on it back in 77 doesn't mean that it wasn't the very same thing. All I'm saying is it was probably more accepted. Now, if a male partner said to his wife, or any partner said, I'm not having you drive, alarm bells, we'd be like, what is going on here? But obviously in that time you could say it. But I mean, Beverly does say, well, that would make you completely independent of Tone, wouldn't it? She says it. She calls it out for what it is, which is control.
It's interesting you say about Angela, because through most of it, you get the idea that she's meek, that he overpowers her generally. And again, her backstory, that she comes from a home which hasn't filled her with confidence. She's had a lot of siblings. There's a certain amount of repression, therefore, never got to have parties. And then again, her father is terrible to her mother. Hardly speaks to her. He's still as rotten to her as he's always been, even though her mother's ill. So inevitably, she seems to lack confidence. She says, I never thought anyone would marry me. But there is also a strength in her, isn't there? She is a nurse.
And she's very good at it, yeah.
Yeah. Mike Leigh made that point, that underneath her apparent silliness is this tough, practical reliability of an experienced working nurse. But there's also a woman who wants to be more independent, stronger. She wants to learn to drive. She wants to party and dance and have more sex than she's getting. She wants children. She wants to eat curry, even if her husband doesn't.
Yeah.
There's some part of her is there to come out.
Yeah, because everybody is in a kind of straitjacket of the time, of the social norms, and also of what was the done thing in their family. You know, we all, oh, I'm never going to be like my mother. I'm never going to be like my father. And the next thing you know, you're doing exactly what they did and saying exactly what they did. And that we pass on these habits or these traumas. And two women in this play that didn't want to be in a relationship like their mum and dad had, and they are.
Yeah.
And they're playing out the same pain and frustration unless they do something about it.
But it's interesting you're saying about Tony and Angela at the end, because I think for all his exasperation with her, there's a moment at the end where she has a cramp in her leg and she seems to be needing some help. And he rushes to her side and is concerned. I think he needs her. I think that he actually loves her, even if she exasperates him. There's something there that's going to be okay if he can get past his own anger issues, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
What about Susan? Can we talk very briefly about her? As we said earlier, she's from a different class, isn't she? And it was fascinating we talk about class because this very morning, I heard on the radio a phone-in on BBC where they were asking people to define what class they belong to and how the categories of class are defined. It's
a minefield.
Well, yeah, and if we think this obsession is outdated, forget it. This was fascinating, and it is a minefield. She comes from a different substrata of what we might broadly call it middle class. She definitely is different. She asks for sherry to drink. She's got a different accent. She's married to an architect, or was. So she represents something different, doesn't she? She's beautifully played, by the way, by Pat and Dora Cullen in your production, in her sensible clothes and her quiet, good manners. In fact, her manners are a bit of the downfall, aren't they? She's so English because she can't say no to Beverly. So she ends up...
Yes, it's a very English situation. It's a very, very British situation. Even now, it's painful because it's true. We don't always say, I mean, in suburbia, at dinner parties or gatherings or whatever, you just don't rock the boat. So in a way, she's a victim and also a perpetrator to herself, that she doesn't just go, look, sod off, stop asking me about my marriage and back off. But she's trapped.
Yes. And no, I don't want another drink. And no, I don't want a cigarette.
No. Yeah.
Or I don't want to dance with Lawrence.
Yeah.
That's excruciating.
It is.
Where they're both forced to dance and neither of them want to.
I know. It's cringe.
But it's also a bit sad thinking about her life as essentially a single mother with her ex-husband, is remarried and planning a second family, lives just down the road and comes still for Sunday lunch. Oh my God.
I know, it is sad, but I feel like saying to Sue, it's just a process, because she says she never fought with her husband. And I think from our conversations in rehearsal, they probably had quite a nice marriage and there were no big arguments and any of that. And I think he probably had an affair and she had no clue. And so she is in shock, the shock of somebody who didn't realize that someone was doing that to her and has left. But I suspect she's still in love with him. She still has him over for dinner on Sunday. I mean, this awful man still loving her food. And, obviously they've got children together, so they're never not going to be in each other's lives. But you do feel for her and her pain. But at the same time, you just think, Sue, just hang on in there, because you're a single woman. You're going to have a great time. Look at these marriages around you. They're awful. These people are being awful. You're the only one who's free and happy. She probably goes home going, thank God.
It's funny you say that, because at some point, and I think it's Angela, says, are you going to get married again or have a boyfriend? And she says she has no expectations of meeting anyone else. And you can sort of believe that and think very sadly. But then you think, actually, maybe she thinks she's well enough out of it. I don't know.
She might not think that, but I think that on her behalf.
Right. Okay. I do worry about her challenge with her daughter too, though. Abigail is the next generation, bringing her up. Abigail's 15.
Yeah, but anyone who's got a teenager has a challenge.
That's true. She's got a streak of pink dye in her hair, dresses in patched jeans with safety pins, and was seen getting off someone's motorbike. And there's a party going on next door with a couple of colored chaps and a girl roared up in a Ford Capri. That's trouble. Ford Capri.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we feel for Sue in her challenges. Can we talk about the ending of the play? And I know we may give something away here, but Beverly and Lawrence have had a stand-up row about art and taste, and she goes off to get this erotic painting that is hanging in their bedroom that she loves and he hates, which is pretty symbolic. And all the rest of them, understandably, are thinking, I think we should get out of here now. Tony's very short with Angela and says, we're going. Sue tries to sneak out. But in these heated moments, Lawrence suffers a heart attack. How would you describe Beverly's reaction and where it leaves her at the end?
I think the first thing to say in real terms is they're drunk. They're really drunk. And so all the normal, rational behaviors. They're already wading through treacle. And so it's very surreal. She first thinks he's just passed out. And she's been warning him of his health and being a workaholic and smoking. There's been several warning shots to Lawrence. But of course, what Beverly doesn't realize is she is one of the biggest stress factors in his life. So yes, it's darkly ironic, it's funny, but it's also incredibly sad. I find that moment really, really moving. So it starts off really funny and she thinks he's passed out and she's smoking in his face and trying to shout to him while people are rushing around and calling 999 and everybody's running around and panicking, and Beverly sort of becomes this operatic, tragic figure who, I think, for all her posturing and all her bitching, that she absolutely doesn't want to lose Lawrence. And I think she is devastated and shocked at the end. And I think she won't be able to cope because he's the breadwinner. Everything around her life has been this marriage. I mean, of course, she might pick herself up and so on, but however vile she's been to him that night, and however vile people have been in marriages to each other and say the worst things in the world, I don't think she would ever wish him to be dead.
No, the idea that she's going to find herself on her own is horrific.
Well, she says, I'm really quite fond of him. It's a hypocrisy because she's been telling him to sod off and drop dead a minute ago. So,
yes.
But, it's that sad irony in life that we don't know what we've got till it's gone. And I'm not saying they should be together in any way, but certainly she doesn't wish him to be dead.
It's amazing how much goes on in a very short time in her reactions and what's happening. As you say, it's overlaid by the fact he's very drunk and initially doesn't really understand what's going on. So she remains in character, so to speak, the posturing. She's bullish and thinks if she shouts at him, he'll get up, and shouts at the others that it'll all be fine. And she doesn't even give up the hostess role. There's this extraordinary moment where she offers everyone a glass of brandy, still playing the hostess while her husband is lying on the floor. But as it develops, you can see she's becoming more really scared, angry as well to be put in this position in some way. So it's complicated in that sense. But at the end, yeah, I think bereft because the idea that she's going to be on her own. It's interesting you say that she'll be devastated and how will she cope? That's a really great question. I sort of couldn't help but think she'll find another man, partly because she has to.
She might. There's another play to be had, but I think she's on autopilot. She's in shock. The thing is with Beverly, she offers everyone a drink because she wants one.
Yes, true.
She offers everyone a cigarette because she wants one. And that's her kind of obsession and habit or pathology, whatever it is.
Escape. But that's escape too for her.
Escape. And I think, she's probably an alcoholic.
I mean, there's an image, Beverly on the floor, a kind of terrible tableau. But actually, the final lines of the play belong to Susan, who's trying to call Abigail at the party and is shouting down the phone because the music's so loud at the other end and she cannot be heard. And I don't know whether she actually speaks to Abigail or not. But again, it's funny, I guess, coming back to the title. But why does the play end with that as the final lines?
I couldn't tell you, but I think Abigail represents, for me, the future, the next generation, and punk music. The way she's described, she does sound like a punk, safety pins and colored hair. And I think that idea of anarchy was about breaking down these false social gods and just letting rip, because society as it was is a social construct. And I think that's what Abigail represents. And she's coming of age, like her mum's going, "It's mummy," and someone's probably down the phone going, "Sod off," or "Who?"
It's definitely the next generation. And it's, I think, a clever construct of the play that there are these two parties sitting side by side because there's inevitable comparison. They're set against each other in a way, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the old and all these conventions, this behavior against this other world that's coming.
And the other world is infiltrating. You can't stop it. The party's getting louder and louder next door.
Yes. Great, Nadia. think we've run over your time. Before I let you go, I don't know whether you were forewarned, but one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover at some point on the podcast, or really that's just a personal favorite.
Wow.
Maybe it's one you're going to do in the future.
Oh, I couldn't give that away, no. I've loved so many plays. My taste is really eclectic, so it's a hard question. I mean, yeah, I like so many different types of things.
This is really putting you on the spot, I can tell.
It really, really is. I mean, I like anything by George Bernard Shaw. I think it sounds old and dusty, but the acrobatics of his mind and the stubbornness of his thought. The first play I ever did at the National Theatre was a random George Bernard Shaw called The Doctor's Dilemma. And I was like, why has Nick Heitner given me this show of all the plays he could have given me? But I actually loved his words and his poetry and the way he can be dexterous around an idea and still keep it interesting in the actor's mouth. And I've done plays by so many great playwrights, new, dead, old, young, but I've never met words like George Bernard Shaw. And I'd love to do another George Bernard Shaw play at some point.
It's great to hear you say that, because I think he's not necessarily in fashion being as wordy as he is.
No. And I can see why, but you know, all the great playwrights, they get the human condition. You just recognize it. What they are a kind of shaman. They sort of conjure up the spirit of what it is. And we know whether it's a wordy play or something a little bit more abstract or physical, that what they do is they do something we know is true. And when it's not true, we feel it. We're uncomfortable. We wriggle in our seats and we go, oh, that doesn't feel like anything I recognize. They're incredible, these playwrights. And I'm a fan of plays as well. You know, I love abstract, physical, less words, but I also like a lot of words.
So Nadia, it strikes me that having just nudged you there, we could talk for quite a bit longer about plays you love and playwrights you love. But we're going to stop at that point. Thank you very much for your time today and for your insight and your wonderful production of Abigail's Party, which continues at the Theatre Royal Stratford East until the 12th of October. Thank you very much, Nadia. Great to meet you.
Thank you.
As the curtain falls on Mike Leigh's period tragi-comedy, does it feel too much of its period to speak to today? I think we have to admit that we're all still prone to judge each other by the outward fabric of our lives and how that reflects our monetary wealth or cultural credentials. The reality TV devoted to the makeover of our houses, the middle-class dinner party conversations about house prices, schools, book groups, or skiing holidays. The lifestyle details we share may change, but our material and social aspiration and our compulsion to appraise others and ourselves do not. There is a risk that we can be too enamored of the retro style of this play, its period design and social paradigms. But it is not, as Leigh himself points out, just an exercise in kitsch, because underneath there are universal human truths about aspiration and identity, the need to belong, as well as about honesty and generosity, or the lack thereof, in intimate relationships. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.